The first armored vehicle had barely reached the midpoint of the pontoon bridge when the river erupted. Artillery rounds, pre-registered, pre-positioned, called with corrections that Ukrainian spotters had been refining for hours while Russian engineers completed their work, landed on the bridge structure within seconds of each other. FPV drones that had been holding at altitude, waiting for the moment when Russian armor was most committed and most vulnerable, came down fast toward the vehicles at the bridge approaches. The tank on the bridge had nowhere to go. Behind it, more vehicles were already on the approach ramp. Ahead of it, the bridge structure was beginning to fail. Below it, the river that Russian engineers had spent the entire night trying to cross. What followed, in the next 8 minutes, was the destruction of a Russian river crossing operation that had required weeks of planning, specialized equipment, highly trained engineering personnel, and the movement of irreplaceable bridging assets to the eastern Ukrainian front. All of it consumed in a single Ukrainian fires package that turned the crossing point into a debris field and sent Russian armor into a river that Ukrainian commanders had been watching all night. This is the story of how Ukrainian intelligence, artillery, and drone teams worked together to identify, track, and destroy a Russian pontoon bridge crossing operation before it could deliver the armored force waiting on the far bank. And this is what that operation cost Russia, not just in the bridge and the vehicles lost, but in the strategic calculation that Russia's engineering capability represents in the context of this conflict. The preparation for this engagement began when Ukrainian reconnaissance drone operators, conducting routine surveillance of the river corridor in eastern Ukraine during the late evening hours, observed unusual activity on the Russian-controlled bank. Engineering vehicles and bridge layer platforms and the heavy trucks carrying pontoon sections were moving toward the river under cover of darkness. The movement was deliberate and coordinated, which distinguished it from normal logistics traffic. Ukrainian operators flagged the activity immediately and requested priority tasking of additional drone assets to the location. Within 90 minutes of the initial observation, Ukrainian commanders had a developing picture of a planned pontoon bridge construction operation. The river at this crossing point was approximately 60 meters wide, within the capability of the Russian bridging equipment being observed. The approach roads on the Russian-controlled bank led to terrain that Ukrainian planners had previously assessed as a potential axis for Russian armor. A route that, if a crossing could be established, would allow Russian forces to move into a section of eastern Ukraine where Ukrainian defensive preparations were less developed. The stakes of what was being observed were significant. A successful river crossing at this location, with the armor that Russian engineers were apparently preparing to push across it, could have created operational problems for Ukrainian forces in the sector. Ukrainian commanders understood this. The response they ordered was not improvised. It was a deliberate targeting decision. Let the bridge be built. Let Russian armor begin to commit to the crossing, then destroy the bridge at the moment of maximum Russian vulnerability and maximum Russian loss. This decision, to wait and allow Russian engineers to complete their work before destroying it, required both tactical confidence and operational nerve. Ukrainian commanders had to be confident that their fires could destroy the bridge on their timeline before Russian armor crossed in sufficient numbers to create a tactical problem. They had to be confident that their drone observation could maintain continuous coverage of the construction operation without being detected and without triggering Russian countermeasures that might cause the crossing to be abandoned or relocated. And they had to manage the tension between destroying the bridge early and with certainty versus waiting for the moment when Russian forces were most committed and most destructible. They chose to wait. They maintained surveillance through the night. Ukrainian artillery crews pre-registered their fires against the crossing point. Walking adjustment rounds through the position in the hours before Russian engineering activity began, under the cover of routine harassment fires that Russian observers would not have distinguished from normal Ukrainian artillery activity. The coordinates were confirmed. The fire mission data was prepared. Ukrainian FPV teams were briefed, positioned, and waiting. Russian engineers worked through the night. Building a pontoon bridge across a 60-meter river in the dark, under tactical conditions, with enemy forces operating on the far bank, is not a simple task. It requires experienced bridging troops, functioning specialized equipment, and careful coordination between the engineer teams on the water and the vehicle operators, bringing bridge sections to the bank. Russian pontoon bridging units are specialists. They train specifically for this mission. They understand the equipment, and the operation they were conducting on this night reflected genuine engineering skill. They completed the bridge in the early morning hours. The first vehicle began to cross as the sky was just beginning to lighten, a T-72 moving carefully across the pontoon sections, the bridge flexing under the vehicle's weight. The engineers on the bank watching the crossing with what must have been satisfaction at the completion of a difficult night's work. Ukrainian drone operators watching from altitude tracked every second of the vehicle's progress across the bridge. Artillery spotters relayed the picture to the gun lines. FPV teams received the execution order. The first artillery rounds landed on the bridge structure when the T-72 was approximately 30 meters past the midpoint, past the point of no return, committed to the crossing, with the far bank still 25 meters away. The rounds struck the pontoon sections behind the tank, severing the connection between the sections and the anchor points that held the bridge against the river current. The bridge structure began to rotate downstream. The T-72, its driver now frantically attempting to accelerate to the far bank, found the bridge surface tilting beneath its tracks. The second artillery salvo landed on the approach ramp on the Russian-controlled bank, where a BMP-3 and two BTR armored personnel carriers had been moving onto the bridge structure in sequence behind the lead tank. The ramp structure collapsed. The BMP, partially onto the pontoon sections, lost its footing and went into the river. The BTRs behind it stopped at the bank edge. FPV drones engaged the vehicles at the approach ramp simultaneously with the second artillery salvo, a coordination of fires that left Russian vehicle commanders no time to reverse off the approach and no time to organize any defensive response. Two drones struck the lead BTR and the engineering command vehicle that had been supervising the crossing operation from a position just back from the bank. A third drone tracked the BMP that had entered the river and struck it as it was swept downstream. The T-72 on the bridge reached the far bank. It drove off the collapsing bridge structure onto Ukrainian-held ground. It lasted approximately 3 minutes. Ukrainian anti-tank missile teams that had been positioned to cover exactly this contingency, a vehicle that made it across before the bridge was destroyed, engaged it from two directions. The first missile hit the track and immobilized the vehicle. The second missile ended the engagement. 8 minutes, from first artillery impact to the destruction of the last vehicle that made it across. The bridge was gone. The approach ramp was destroyed. The engineering command vehicle was burning. The BMP was at the bottom of the river or downstream. And the significant Russian armored force that had been waiting on the far bank, the reason the bridge was being built in the first place, was still on the Russian-controlled side of the river, its crossing opportunity destroyed, its passage to the Ukrainian interior closed. Russian forces at the bank came under Ukrainian long-range fires as they attempted to withdraw their remaining vehicles from the crossing area. The concentration of armor and engineering equipment at a single point, a concentration that Russian commanders had assembled to support the crossing operation, was now a target-rich environment for Ukrainian artillery that had the coordinates already registered. Now let us examine what Russia lost. A Russian military pontoon bridging set, the TMM or PP-2005 type systems typically employed for operations of this type, represents a capital investment of $15 to $25 million USD, depending on the specific configuration and the current replacement cost under Russian procurement conditions. These are specialized assets that are not produced in large quantities even in peacetime. Under current sanctions pressure and the accumulated strain on Russian defense industrial output, the replacement timeline for a destroyed bridging set is measured in months, not weeks. Russia does not have an unlimited supply of these systems, and every one destroyed represents a reduction in Russian operational flexibility at river crossings throughout the theater. The vehicles lost in and around the crossing add significantly to the material cost. The T-72 that crossed and was immediately destroyed, $3.5 to $4.5 million. The BMP-3 in the river, $2 to $2.5 million. The BTR destroyed at the approach ramp, $700,000 to $900,000. The engineering command vehicle, $1.5 to $2 million. Additional vehicles damaged or destroyed by Ukrainian long-range fires during the withdrawal from the crossing area. Estimated $4 to $8 million in additional losses. Total material cost of this engagement, conservatively $27 to $43 million USD. for a bridge that stood for less than 30 minutes and delivered one tank to the wrong side of the river. The personnel cost compounds the material figure. Russian pontoon bridging specialists are not common soldiers. They are trained engineers who have completed specialized courses in river crossing operations, equipment maintenance, and the tactical employment of bridging assets under fire. The training pipeline for a qualified military bridging specialist takes 18 months to 2 years. The experienced NCOs and officers who supervise bridging operations, who know the equipment, who know the river current calculations, who know how to adapt to unexpected conditions during a crossing, represent years of accumulated technical expertise. The bridging troops who were working at the crossing point when Ukrainian fires arrived were killed, wounded, or scattered. The engineering command element that was supervising the operation was destroyed. The institutional knowledge that those individuals carried, the specific expertise in pontoon bridge construction that makes future crossing operations possible at the same level of competence, went with them. Russia will attempt another crossing. Russian engineers will study what happened at this crossing and attempt to incorporate countermeasures, more aggressive suppression of Ukrainian observation drones, faster crossing timelines, improved camouflage of approach routes, decoy bridging operations to draw Ukrainian fires before the actual crossing. Ukrainian commanders will watch, adapt, and respond, but the specific bridging equipment destroyed in this engagement is gone. The specific personnel lost are gone, and the armored force that was waiting to cross, the force whose movement across the river was the operational objective of the entire crossing operation, remained on the wrong side of the river, its axis of advance blocked, its operational purpose unfulfilled. Ukrainian drone operators watched a Russian pontoon bridge get built through the night. Ukrainian artillery crews had their fire missions ready before the first vehicle touched the bridge surface. Ukrainian FPV operators flew into position in the pre-dawn darkness. Ukrainian anti-tank missile teams were covering the far bank before Russian engineers had finished their work. None of this happened by accident. All of it happened because Ukrainian commanders understood what Russian engineers were building, understood what it was intended to achieve, and built a response that was ready before the bridge was complete. Russia built a bridge. Ukraine destroyed it at the moment it mattered most. One tank made it across. One tank. In exchange for tens of millions of dollars in bridging equipment, vehicles, and irreplaceable engineering personnel. The river in eastern Ukraine is still flowing. The pontoon sections are gone. And the far bank, the Ukrainian bank, is still in Ukrainian hands. Ukraine watches, Ukraine waits, Ukraine destroys. To fully understand what this engagement represents, it is worth examining the specific chain of events that allowed Ukrainian forces to be in exactly the right position, with exactly the right capabilities, at exactly the right moment, because none of it happened by chance. The Ukrainian drone operators who first observed the Russian engineering movement did so during what was nominally a routine surveillance patrol of the river corridor. Ukrainian drone teams conduct these patrols continuously, not because they expect to observe something significant on every flight, but because the only way to catch something significant when it happens is to have eyes on the area at all times. The surveillance culture that Ukrainian forces have developed along the Eastern Front, the commitment to persistent observation, the protocols for flagging unusual activity, the rapid queuing of additional collection assets when something interesting is observed, is itself a capability that took years to build and that has no simple substitute. When the drone operator who first spotted the Russian engineering movement flagged it, the response was rapid. Additional drone assets were redirected to the crossing point. The developing picture was transmitted up the intelligence chain and simultaneously to the artillery units and the FPV teams, whose sectors covered the river corridor. By the time Russian engineers had laid the first pontoon sections on the water, Ukrainian commanders several echelons up the command chain already knew a crossing was being attempted and had authorized the wait and destroy approach. The decision to wait and to allow the bridge to be completed and to allow Russian armor to begin committing to the crossing before striking was a deliberate operational calculation. Ukrainian commanders weighed several factors. Striking the engineering operation before the bridge was complete would destroy the bridging equipment, but would not catch the armored force that was the real objective. Russian engineers might be able to reconstitute at a different crossing point with reserve equipment, and the armored force would still be available for future operations. Waiting until the bridge was complete and armor was in the crossing sequence meant taking a small risk, the possibility that some armor might complete the crossing before fires arrived. In exchange for the certainty of destroying both the bridge and the maximum number of vehicles in the most vulnerable position they could be in. Committed to a crossing, unable to maneuver, unable to retreat. The calculation proved correct. The fires arrived at exactly the right moment. The bridge was destroyed while one vehicle was on it, and additional vehicles were committed to the approach. The bridging equipment was destroyed. The engineering personnel were killed or wounded. The armored force on the far bank remained stranded. And the one vehicle that made it across, the T-72 that drove off a collapsing bridge onto Ukrainian ground, lasted 3 minutes. The anti-tank missile teams that destroyed that vehicle deserve specific recognition. They had been positioned to cover the far bank contingency before the bridge was complete. The possibility that one or more vehicles might make it across before the bridge was destroyed. Their position, their pre-registered fires against the landing zone, and their rapid engagement of the T-72 within minutes of its arrival on the Ukrainian bank reflect the completeness of the Ukrainian defensive plan. Not a single element of the Russian crossing operation was left to chance or improvisation. The FPV operators who flew against the vehicles at the approach ramp during the artillery fires did so in conditions that require specific acknowledgement. Artillery fires were landing on the crossing area, while drone operators were flying their systems into the same space, a coordination challenge that requires precise timing, clear communication between artillery and drone command elements, and the technical deconfliction procedures that prevent friendly fires from destroying the drones being used to complete the mission. Ukrainian Combined Arms Coordination has developed exactly these deconfliction procedures through operational experience, and they functioned as designed in this engagement. The FPV teams hit their targets while artillery was still working the bridge structure. The coordination held. Now consider the broader strategic dimension of what was lost here. Beyond the immediate material and personnel cost, Russian operational planning in eastern Ukraine is constrained by the river and water obstacles that cross the operational area. Where Russian forces need to advance across those obstacles, they have limited options. Existing bridges, which Ukrainian forces monitor and which Russian forces know, are under constant threat of strike. Ford sites, which are limited by vehicle weight and water depth. And pontoon bridging, which provides the flexibility to cross at locations of Russian commanders' choosing, but which requires specialized equipment and takes time to emplace. The destruction of a bridging set reduces Russian operational flexibility at exactly the points where flexibility matters most, at water obstacles, where the ability to choose the crossing point and the crossing time is the difference between a surprise operation that catches Ukrainian defenders repositioning and a predictable approach that walks into a prepared defense. Every Russian bridging unit that loses its equipment becomes a unit that can plan river crossings but cannot execute them until replacement equipment arrives. Under current Russian logistics conditions, with the defense industrial base under sanctions pressure and production capacity strained, replacement timelines are measured in months. A crossing operation planned for next week cannot be executed if the bridging equipment was destroyed this week and the replacement set is 3 months away. This is the operational depth of what Ukrainian fires achieved in this engagement. Not just the destruction of vehicles and personnel at the crossing point, not just the prevention of this specific crossing operation, but the degradation of Russian bridging capability across the theater, the reduction of Russian options at every water obstacle for however long it takes to replace what was lost. Ukrainian commanders understand this calculation. Bridging assets are high-value targets not because they are expensive to replace, though they are, but because they are functionally irreplaceable on any operationally relevant timeline. An armored force without bridging is a force whose operational options are permanently constrained by the presence of water obstacles. Destroying Russian bridging capability is not simply winning an engagement. It is reshaping the operational geometry of the conflict in ways that compound over time. The personnel dimension of this strategic calculation is equally significant. Russian military bridging specialists, the engineers who know the equipment, who can rig a pontoon section in the dark, who understand river current calculations and anchor point mechanics, and the dozens of other technical details that make a river crossing work under tactical conditions, are not produced quickly. The training pipeline is long. The experience that makes an engineer truly capable at this mission takes years of repetition to develop. The personnel lost in this engagement cannot be replaced by mobilizing additional conscripts and running them through an abbreviated bridging course. The skills are too specific and too demanding. Russia's response to this loss will be predictable. Increased attention to concealment of future bridging operations. Attempt to suppress Ukrainian drone observation over river corridors before committing engineering assets. Shorter construction timelines through pre-staging of equipment closer to crossing points. More aggressive electronic warfare to degrade Ukrainian communications between observation assets and fires. Each of these countermeasures will require Ukrainian adaptation. Ukrainian commanders will develop countermeasures, different drone profiles, different communications protocols, different targeting timelines. The cycle of adaptation will continue. But it will continue from a starting point where Russia has lost bridging equipment it cannot quickly replace, personnel it cannot quickly develop, and a crossing site it cannot use again. Because Ukrainian artillery has the coordinates registered and the fire missions ready. The river in eastern Ukraine did not care about Russian operational plans. It was simply a river. It was the Ukrainian intelligence analysts, the drone operators, the artillery crews, and the anti-tank teams who turned it into an operational obstacle that a Russian armored force could not cross. Russia built a bridge across that obstacle. Ukraine destroyed the bridge. Russia lost the crossing, the equipment, the engineers, and the one tank that made it over. The river in eastern Ukraine is still flowing. The Ukrainian bank is still held. And Ukrainian forces are still watching the water. Ukraine watches, Ukraine strikes, Ukraine holds. That is not a slogan. It is a description of what happened on a specific river in eastern Ukraine on a specific night in early April. Ukrainian drone operators watched Russian engineers work through the cold hours before dawn. Ukrainian artillery crews stood ready through those same hours, their fire missions pre-registered, their systems verified, their crews at readiness. Ukrainian FPV operators waited in their concealed positions with their systems armed and their sectors assigned. Ukrainian anti-tank teams were in position on the far bank before the bridge was finished. When the moment came, when that first T-72 reached the midpoint of a bridge that Russian engineers had spent the night building, Ukraine's defenders were already in the process of destroying everything Russia had committed to that crossing. The river is the same river it was before this engagement. The crossing point is the same geography. What changed is that Russia spent significant resources, equipment, personnel, time, planning, attempting to use that crossing point, and Ukraine turned that attempt into a catastrophic loss. A bridge built through the night, destroyed in 8 minutes, $30 million in equipment, and irreplaceable bridging capability, gone before morning. Russia brought that bridge to eastern Ukraine. Ukraine sent it to the bottom of the river. Ukraine watches, Ukraine strikes, Ukraine holds the bank.